This is Cedric Richmond, the former congressman and current senior advisor to Joe Biden. On June 27, 2021, Richmond appeared on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace.
And let's talk about who defunded the police. When we were in Congress last year trying to pass a rescue plan, I'm sorry, not the rescue plan, but an emergency relief plan for cities that were cash-strapped and laying off police and firefighters, it was the Republicans who objected to it.
Republicans argued that much of this emergency relief was nothing more than a bailout for Democratic states and localities. But on the other hand, do you remember outrage from Democrats that police weren't being funded? Yeah, neither do I. Instead, Democrats were talking about defunding the police, reimagining the police, and even abolishing the police.
I'm actively engaged in advocacy for is the reduction of really truly talking about the reduction of our NYPD budget and defunding a $6 billion NYPD budget.
Yes, I support the defund movement because this is about the investment in our communities, which have historically been divested from.
This model of saying, not only do we need to defund, but we need to dismantle and start anew, allows us to really reimagine what public safety should look like in our community. The police department here in Minneapolis needs to be dismantled, and we need to start anew.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. You're featuring members of the squad, Andrew, and they don't represent mainstream Democrats, right?
The status quo way of thinking about achieving safety is really wrong when it assumes that the best way to achieve more safety is to put more police on the streets.
I think that a big part of this conversation really is about reimagining how we do public safety in America, which I support.
And when asked directly, Harris played stupid.
Are you for defunding the police?
How are you defining defund the police?
Well, I'm not for anything remotely for that, so I would ask the protesters the same.
So if Harris wasn't for defunding the police, then she would have denied that she was. But at the same time, being pro-police or being tough on crime wasn't polling well for Democrats, so you be the judge.
And in fact, they didn't get funding until the American Rescue Plan, which our plan allowed state and local governments to replenish their police departments and do the other things that are needed.
Except the problem is that even if Congress rushed out money to replenish police departments, many local governments had different plans.
Breaking overnight, the City Council passed the New York City budget, which includes redistributing $1 billion from the NYPD budget. Protesters calling to defund the police are remaining camped out in City Hall Park. That's after the mayor agreed to cut the department's funding and put that money into other social and youth services. Some believe the cuts do not go far enough.
And it wasn't just New York. Cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles made moves to defund their police departments. And then there's Minneapolis, whose city council members went a step further and vowed not only to defund the police, but to abolish the department entirely.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it, and to recreate systems of public safety that actually keep us safe.
Soon after, the Minneapolis City Council voted unanimously to revise the city's charter to permit dismantling the police department and, reimagine it. So the question is, if these localities are doing what they can to cut back on policing, then what's the rush to fund what they're cutting?
So look, Republicans are very good at staying on talking points of who says defund the police, but the truth is they defunded the police.
Oh, really? I guess we had this all wrong, guys. It wasn't the Democrats, it was those damn Republicans.
Congressman Banks, you voted against that package, against that $350 billion, just like every other Republican in the House and Senate. So can't you make the argument that it's you and the Republicans who are defunding the police?
No, you can't make that argument, Chris. Let me spell it out for you. First, let's look at the bill. There's $195.3 billion for the 50 states and DC, $130.2 billion for cities, local government, and counties, $20 billion for tribal governments, and $4.5 billion for the territories. And that funding isn't specifically for police. That $350 billion is being allocated to states and localities to make up for lost tax revenue due to the pandemic. keep in mind that states and localities choose where that money goes. And if a city is for defunding the police, then chances are that funding will go elsewhere. And I should point out that while every single Republican voted against the American Rescue Plan, the bill was passed and signed into law.
On this vote, the yeas are 220, the nays are 211. The motion is adopted.
And if the bill was passed, Chris, that means that the funding went through, right? And if the funding went through, then how can you accuse Republicans of defunding? But whatever, Chris. Keep trying to gaslight your viewers for that sweet, sweet establishment approval. Speaking of gaslighting, here's White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki spinning a bunch of nonsense about why Republicans voted against the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan.
Also ensuring there's specific guidance to communities across the country to ensure that they have funding to get more community police around the country, something that was supported by the American Jobs Plan that was voted into law by Democrats just a couple of months ago. Some might say that the other party was for defunding the police.
And some might say that Jen Psaki's full of it.
I'll let others say that, but that's a piece.
Yeah, that's a piece, all right.
Well, the president did mention that the American Rescue Plan, the state and local funding, something that was supported by the president, a lot of Democrats who supported and voted for the bill, could help ensure local cops were kept on the beat in communities across the country.
But notice the subtlety here. It could help ensure that cops stay on the street, as opposed to would help.
State and local funding could help ensure local cops were kept on the beat.
And she is saying could instead of would because localities decide what to do with that money. And if their goal is defunding the police, guess who's likely not to see any money?
You mentioned at the last briefing that you think Republicans wanted to defund the police because they did not support the American Rescue Plan. Which Republican ever said that they did not like the American Rescue Plan because they wanted to defund the police?
And that's a question that Jen Psaki cannot answer because Republicans in Congress who want to defund the police do not exist. So instead, she's going to misdirect.
Well, first, let me just note that the president ran and won the most votes of any candidate in history on a platform of boosting funding for law enforcement.
Oh, sure. Remember when Joe Biden was running as the law and order candidate? Give me a freaking break.
The president ran and won the most votes of any candidate in history on a platform of boosting funding for law enforcement after Republicans spent decades trying to cut the cops program. There's record of that.
Here, Jen Psaki is being carefully misleading by trying to pull up an obscure part of Biden's platform and spinning it as funding for police. Psaki isn't actually talking about general funding for cops. She is literally referring to the COPS program, also known as Community-Oriented Policing Services, which was part of the 1994 crime bill under the name Cops on the Beat. This is basically a public safety and community policing grant program. And it was such an important part of his platform that Biden included it in a small 141-word blurb on his website.
And then also stood in the way of crucial funding needed to prevent the laying off of police officers as crimes increased. That's a simple statement of fact.
She is so full of it. If funding the police was so important to the Democrats, they would have introduced a bill specifically to provide funding for police departments. But they didn't. Instead, they spent months denying that there was even a problem.
And I will note that while the president ran on and won the most votes of any candidate in history on a platform of boosting funding for law enforcement after Republicans spent decades trying to cut the COPS program, which again is public record. We don't need to undervalue the intelligence of the American people.
Yet she's totally undervaluing the intelligence of the American people because all they have to do is look it up. According to the Congressional Research Service, funding for the COPS program actually increased under the first 2 years of the Trump administration. There was a notable change in the total amount of funding provided for cops since 2011. From 2012 to 2017, approximately $200 million was provided for the COPS account, though funding for cops increased to $276 million for fiscal year 2018 and to $304 million for fiscal year 2019. So even though funding to the program was increased, watch Jen Psaki claim that Trump and the Republicans decreased the funding.
If you oppose funding for the COPS program, something that was dramatically cut by the prior administration and many Republicans supported.
Jen Psaki lives in the opposite world. So I'm going to destroy the Democrats' whole narrative here by asking the following. If the COPS program was so important, then why didn't the Democrats specifically include funding for the COPS program in the American Rescue Plan? Spoiler alert, because Democrats didn't care. But they sure are pretending they do now, because as it turns out, crime waves don't pull well with voters. Anyway, that's it for now. A very special thanks to Poofy for her help with this week's script, and be sure that you're still subscribed to the channel. And as always, I hope to see you next time. If there is next time.